It's an honor for me to present to you Farhana Sultana, who is currently a professor at the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. There, she is also the research director for environmental collaboration and conflicts in the program for the advancement of research on conflicts and collaboration. In addition to these appointments, Farhana Sultana is a visiting faculty at the International Center for Climate Change and Development of the Independent University in Bangladesh, from where she is connected to us today. Just a quick side note, it could be that Farhana may have internet issues during her keynote and therefore may turn off her video if it's necessary. Prior to Syracuse University, she was a faculty member in the Department of Geography at King's College London, and she worked at the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. Farhana Sultana is one of the world's leading theorists of political ecology, post-colonial development, decolonizing knowledge, water governance, climate change, and social justice. For her exceptional work, she received the Clean Laws Award of the American Association of Geographers in 2019 for her, I quote, outstanding contributions to geographic research on social issues. Dr. Sultana co-authored many publications and has written a lot of articles and several books. The Right to Water, published in 2012, Eating, Drinking, Surviving, published in 2016, and recently in 2020, Water Politics, Governance, Justice, and the Right to Water. With her work, especially her article, The Unbearable Heaviness of Climate Coloniality, published this year in the journal Political Geography, but also her way of doing critical interdisciplinarity and intersectional research, she is one of the sources of inspiration for this conference. Farhana Sultana is really tackling the challenging questions that are at the core of climate change research. She represents ethical scholarship and collaborates with policymakers, practitioners, civil society, and community groups. We are really, really happy to have you with us as our keynote speaker. Welcome again, Farhana. I am handing to you now.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and greetings from Bangladesh to everyone. I hope you can hear me and this is transmitting all right. I really want to thank all the organizers for organizing the conference, but then also for inviting me to join you today. And thank you for those of you who are here right now, or maybe watching this later on. So today's talk is part of a wider ongoing work for me and draws from some of my recent publications. So I'm going to be putting that information, those publications, at the end of my talk into the Zoom chat, and it'll also show up in the last slide. And hopefully my voice will hold out because I've got a bit of laryngitis going on, unfortunately. So what I'm going to try to do today is draw from some of the work that's been published, but I want to explain for those of you who are a bit unfamiliar with why the dense theoretical work on climate coloniality needs to therefore also align with the empirical evidence so that it is theorized and grounded in lived experiences. And then also why therefore we need to decolonize climate coloniality to really get at the heart of how to move forward. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'll be sharing my screen, and hopefully you can still see me and hear me. If not, if it gets wobbly, just shout it out and I'll turn off my video, all right? So what I want to start with is last year's COP, not just the one that ended like yesterday. So in a speech that went really viral right after the COP in November of 2021, and for those of you who may not be familiar, this was the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties on Climate. That's what COP stands for. Prime Minister of Barbados argued, quote, "We do not want that dreaded death sentence. We have come here today to say, try harder," end quote. So there was a 2-year hiatus because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in 2021, as well as just this past week at COP27, the necessity to halt climate breakdown became something that was really clamored for much more loudly, not that it wasn't before, but I think the pandemic really put things into perspective of mortality, morbidity of our life on Earth. And as we saw in COP26, it was rather dismal, which is also similar to COP27 that just concluded. Many indigenous and environmental activists started to call these various climate solutions to be false and a form of perpetuating colonialism through land grabs, extractions, displacements, and dispossessions. And as a result, even Bolivian president called various carbon offsetting programs and impositions of rules from powerful countries onto historically marginalized countries through the UN system, as well as other international mechanisms, to be the new carbon colonialism. And what this means is post-colonial countries are marginalized further in international negotiations, and the power matrices of control are exerted over both the narratives of climate change and therefore the solutions to how to solve it. So many climate justice activists have for years been insisting on systems change, not just climate change. And we saw a surge in youth climate activists that have stridently critiqued failures of world leaders for various unkept promises. And as a result, what became really evident in the last year or two is that there were greater critiques of these empty promises and much more louder calls about real world politics, such as the simultaneous commandeering of climate justice narratives and greenwashing by the fossil fuel lobby and politicians. And ironically, the fossil fuel industry has had some of the largest delegations to the COPs at all. And this draws greater attention and criticism globally to both the overt and then the covert influence and manipulations of climate policy through the various decades of climate denial, delay, deflections, and dispossessions. So what we witnessed quite a lot last year and this year was that all the way from heads of state to local activists, colonial tactics have been identified and openly called out during and after COPs. So as many dejected climate activists, delegates, and youth from the global South left COP26 last year, that sense of injustice and climate delay were articulated and captured in mainstream media. This it ranged from expressions of grief, anger, sadness, and futility. And we've seen that as well this past week or two coming out of COP27 in Egypt. So while some have framed it in terms of climate justice failures, others have been more direct in calling out colonial and racial tactics of control and disposal of marginalized communities across the global South and elsewhere. And this sense of necropolitics and disposal of marginalized communities across the world have been quite stridently called out, and people were refusing to make nice. And this became much more visible to those who weren't even paying attention. So the various, the varied resistance and oppositional tactics were talked about, written about, and much more widely mainstreamed, which is a good thing. But at the same time, that urgency with which more constituents across borders have argued for better and more effectual outcomes may be on display, but we still saw how the solutions were not very forthcoming just in the very last session of the COP that ran into early hours of the morning the night before last. So such concerns have really led many to express that there's a lot of rage there, and this rage has been quite profound, and because there's a lot of upset. Now, historically, this rage was deemed righteous in the claims of historically marginalized or oppressed countries, because they've been calling for justice and reparations and equity over several decades in several preceding COPs. But now that rage has kind of gone global. Yet it is not equivalent everywhere, nor experienced in the same registers. So what we can see is the COP as theaters of climate colonialism, led by corporations, powerful governments, and elites, yet simultaneously as a site of decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and feminist politics, often led primarily by activists, youth groups, indigenous groups, academics, unions, and so forth. So therefore, what we're seeing is on one hand, you have international climate negotiations that falter in addressing climate change without meaningfully reducing fossil fuel dependency, endless growth models, and hyperconsumption, along with systems that undergird them across scales. Rather, these spaces become spectacles, one of performance or performativity that erases historical and spatial geopolitics and power relations. It becomes a performance of diversion, delay, co-optation without substance that is repeated almost annually at each COP. However, on the other hand, these are also spaces of opportunities to challenge the system, to utter necessary words for more people to hear, to collectivize amongst youth and old activists, learn from different positionalities, create new openings and possibilities of alliances. So in other words, what we're seeing is a repoliticization of climate instead of the depoliticized techno-economistic utopias that never deliver. So the global theaters of climate negotiations showcase the politics and the political, whether it's subaltern or suburban, where they're both reifications and ruptures in what politics is and what constitutes its pathways. So what we saw was a sense of despair, suffocation, stagnation, abandonment, and regression that coexist with revolutionary potentiality, alternative possibilities, collectivizing, world-making, resistance, and critical hope. So as I closely followed the COP26 and more recently 27 events, I recalled an entry many years ago from days when I was a young student. And I'm going to reproduce parts of it here, despite how scattered the thoughts might be from back then, because of the haunting of the words to what we saw at the COP26, COP27, all the COPs before it, all the resistance movements, the foot marches, the protests, and so on. The reason I want to share it is because of the haunting of the words today, how it resonates with contemporary climate politics, such as the ones you see on this image, but also beyond it, and also reflects how the personal is always the political. In other words, this small vignette I'll read out that is bilingual, it's a personal account of the unruly mix of embodied emotions that signals the collective affective registers of contemporary climate politics discussed above. Amar spashto mone ache, I clearly remember that night in April 1991 when a massive tropical cyclone barreled into Bangladesh, how the sound of the storm, the trees churning and buildings shaking scared me throughout the night. I was terrified by the deafening sounds across the land and howling winds outside that battered everything, knowing instinctively that a disaster was unfolding. News broke the next day of the devastation where a 20-foot tall sea surge killed thousands overnight. Later, we would learn it was up to 150,000 people. So many people just stolen by the sea. A gamut of grief, worry, and guilt filled me that day and subsequent days as we read newspapers and looked at images on our small TV of utter devastation, flattened homes and trees, floating carcasses of humans and livestock alike. Most of this country is at sea level, so the water just surged in and took everything away. Amar sab kichu shesh, keu nei. I have lost everything, everyone, cried a woman whose entire family and homestead were swept away, and she barely managed to survive by clinging to a tree for days. Koto khoti, bidhostota, dukkho, so much destruction, devastation, suffering. My immediate family was fortunate as our home was in the floodplains, little further inland from the main sites of devastation along the coast. But we worried about my ancestral home near the coast and our extended family there, of my elderly grandparents and relatives who lived in traditional homes made of wood, bamboo, and clay, in villages deep in the delta marshes of the Bengal Delta, one of the world's largest deltas formed by two of the most powerful rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. Amra matir manush, পলির মাটিতে শিকড়, কিন্তু আমরা প্লাবন ভূমি, নদীর দেশের এবং জোয়ার ভাটার দেশেরও মানুষ. We are people of the soil, rooted in the fertile delta, a people of floodplains crisscrossed by rivers in a land of tidal waves. Tidal rhythms rule everything, and flooding is an annual occurrence during the monsoon season, but devastating cyclones and sea surges were less common. No phones, electricity, or paved roads in the villages existed back then in 1991, so we didn't know how our family was for many days. Coastal communities were historically protected by the Sundarban mangrove forest, but increasingly subjected to tropical cyclone damage and destruction with deforestation. But in coastal villages and towns to the east of the Sundarban mangrove forest, there is no natural protection from the wrath of nature. I kept worrying, the cyclones are coming, killing all. বারবার মনে হলো আমাদের সরকার কি করছে, পৃথিবীর ক্ষমতাশীলরা কি করছে. I was frustrated with thoughts of what our government was going to do, what the global powerful would do. I felt that both the government and the global community didn't do enough to reduce vulnerabilities and risks. Man-made global warming is already upon us. Scholars, journalists, activists, politicians in Bangladesh are already talking about it since we are already feeling the impacts. Indeed, our nation state was birthed only in 1971 in the wake of a massive tropical cyclone of 1970 that sparked the hard-won deadly war of independence from Pakistan for its utter lack of care or concern of our dead and dying here, where a devastating storm became a politically galvanizing force for Bangladeshis. But that's another story for another time. So I constantly worry. I worry what happens to those who are drowned out from more powerful storms and surges, whose water sources are increasingly salinized from rising seas and encroaching seawater, whose land is disappearing from erosion. Where do people take this collective trauma, grief, and anger? আমরা কোথায় যাব? আমাদের কি ভবিষ্যৎ? আমরা কি হস্তছাড়া, পরিত্যক্ত? Where will my people go? What future do we have? Must we remain abandoned, forsaken? The disproportionate burden of climate change is already falling on formerly colonized and brutalized racialized communities in the developing world. We are still colonized, but this time through climate change, the development industry, and globalization. I feel an immense responsibility to do something, but no one is going to listen to someone like me, and even more importantly, more marginalized peoples, women and children, farmers and fisherfolk, writers and scholars. But we are all expected to be resilient because we have no other choice. What empty words resiliency and recovery feel like, such hollowness, so much sorrow. এই শূন্যতা ভারী লাগছে. This emptiness feels heavy. End quote. I'm critically self-reflexive of my geopolitical and intersectional locations as I reproduce this vignette as a form of unorganized testimonial that bears witness to history and coloniality. It is not shared for victimhood or damage narrative, but one of situated knowledge and visceral response to one of the deadliest tropical cyclones of the time, one that ushered in a political conscientization of and planted the seeds towards theorizing climate coloniality through lived experiences. I realize now that I was already writing and thinking decades ago along the lines of what is far better articulated and theorized in the contemporary moment. As I observed the events unfolding at the COP26 and more recently at COP27, I ruefully recall this entry from years ago for the similarities and resonances across the decadal, spatial, and social registers to what is being said now. Many years later, I would read Frantz Fanon and Edward Said in graduate school, noting that I was perhaps articulating that to be colonized is to be made to feel less than, to be told what the truths are, be valued differently over time and place, a dehumanization through an epidermalization of inferiority and being created as racialized other with a capital O. The colonial wound is embodied. It is engraved in bodies and minds. Structural racism structures the world in unequal ways through colonial and imperial violence, both material and epistemological. Fanon gives us tools to think from embodied experiences of climate and colonialism, of geopolitical epistemology and materiality. The spatialization of colonialism's racism and environmental destruction go hand in hand. Climate coloniality reproduces the hauntings of colonialism and imperialism through climate impacts in the post-colony. located primarily in the tropics and subtropics, where climate-induced disasters and shifts have been prevalent for some time. Climate change lays bare the colonialism of not only the past, but an ongoing coloniality that governs and structures our lives, which are co-constitutive of processes of capitalism, imperialism, and international development. The uneven and unequal vulnerabilities and marginalizations of deaths and devastation taken for granted draw attention to continuities from the past and into the present and into the future. It is a slow form of violence. In this paper, I wanted to start by feeling with climate change, explore its heaviness as it insidiously seeps into different aspects of life, the erosions it propels, the suffocations it creates, the intergenerational traumas that remain. The ennui of coloniality creates sensories of being and not being, of belonging and not belonging, of deficiency and capaciousness, of giving in and resisting. I use some autoethnography from ongoing work as a methodological intervention to theorize climate coloniality here. I invite fellow travelers to reflect on their own resonances and connections, where a colonial wound is a fertile ground for analyzing, framing, and feeling otherwise. My contemplations here are not final nor finalized in the least. They continue to marinate and germinate, since there is an unfathomability in the incompleteness of ongoing coloniality. So while academic writing conditions us to write in removed conceptual ways at a level of abstraction that allows for analysis, I want to interlace that with the fleshiness of climate, the past and presence in our bodies, minds, soils, and kin, where theory is in the flesh and struggles form the basis of political consciousness and oppositional epistemologies against oppression in shared worlds, as theorized by scholars Sherry Moraga and Gloria Andalzua, or as the late, great Bell Hooks poignantly articulated, quote unquote, marginality is much more than a site of deprivation. It is also a site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. In some ways, this is perhaps border thinking, or thinking from the borderlands that are oppressed by the colonial matrix of power, but nonetheless resisted, where knowledge can be produced outside of modernity, but in relation to it in decolonial scholarship. Alternative epistemologies and cosmologies emerge from lived experiences that were and are devalued in Eurocentric modernity and climate coloniality. This requires addressing both epistemological and epistemic violences and the material outcomes. By weaving through such mediations today, I offer an understanding of climate coloniality that is theorized and grounded in lived experiences. I demonstrate that confronting climate coloniality also involves reconstituting individual and collective memories and consciousness for reconciliation and liberation. Part of this is accounting for the embodied emotional geographies of climate coloniality. So what is climate coloniality? But let me first elaborate on what coloniality is for those who may be unfamiliar with the term. Coloniality in lived experiences expresses the complexities of coloniality of power and the ongoing and enduring assaults of colonialism through modernity, capitalism, neocolonialism, imperialism, and international development. As theorized by Anibal Quijano and Walter Mignolo, coloniality relies on racial domination and hierarchical power relations established during active colonialism and ongoing in post-colonial space times, where the colonial matrix of power persists. Thus, I argue that climate coloniality occurs where Eurocentric hegemony, neocolonialism, racial capitalism, uneven consumption, and military domination are co-constitutive of climate impacts experienced by variously racialized populations who are disproportionately made vulnerable and disposable. The racial disposability of both those experiencing climate devastation in their homelands and those displaced as climate migrants demonstrate further the curtailing of self-determination and futurities. Ongoing climate coloniality is expressed through insidious racism globally and continuing othering, dispossessions through colonial capitalist extractivism and commodification, rapacious displacement and destruction, creation of sacrifice zones, and disproportionate exposures to harms from more powerful climate-induced hazards, such as the tropical cyclone I discussed a little while ago. So context matters in understanding coloniality. So it isn't just an abstract analysis of the racialization of difference, but an accounting for local, embodied, material, lived experiences of knowing subjects, not people who are just operationalized upon. Historical differences position colonial and imperial countries overall at greater advantage over post-colonial and presently occupied countries. Colonial logics of extractivism continues through neocolonial and development interventions in post-World War II time, because that's what we're living through currently, whether it's active development or insidious globalization or just the basic workings of capitalism. The unequal ecological exchange between the global South and global North, ongoing extractive capitalism, and imperial structures of global trade and domination in setting policies and ideologies all work to maintain climate coloniality. I want to be clear here that I use global South and global North as analytical categories, but also geographical spaces marked by heterogeneity and historical differences. So many scholars have actually quantified this unequal ecological exchange, calling it the ongoing colonial plunder of resources from the global South to the global North, one that contributes to overdeveloping the global North at the expense of the global South. Such processes continue various colonial patterns of harm and dispossession. It has been therefore argued, even at many COPs, and especially last week at the COP27, that the global North owes the global South a climate debt due to climate coloniality and the ever-increasing colonization of the atmosphere. Legacies of imperial violence live on not only through exacerbating environmental degradation, but increasing climate-induced disasters. As frequencies and strengths of climate-fueled natural hazards, such as tropical cyclones, grow, the structural violences of colonialism are further felt corporeally, communally, politically, economically, and ecologically. Slow but compounding violence exacerbates vulnerabilities that maintain climate coloniality and extends it into the future. The racial logic of climate tragedies and cumulative impacts is ever present. The undifferentiated humanity that is assumed in persistent narratives of the Anthropocene simply does not exist. Coloniality is experienced through continued ecological degradations that are both overt and covert, episodic and creeping, whereby global capitalism articulates with development and economic growth ideologies to reproduce various forms of colonial racial harms to entire countries of the global South and communities of color in the global North. Climate coloniality is perpetuated through land and water grabs, deforestation for growth, neoliberal conservation projects, fossil fuel warfare, new green revolutions for agriculture, rare earth mineral mining, and carbon offsetting programs for the wealthy that are dispossessing the historically impoverished who are often elsewhere, as was mentioned in the introduction a little while ago. Interventions are called by various names and have various tenors, such as green colonialism, carbon colonialism, fossil capitalism, but often with similar outcomes of domination, displacement, degradation, and impoverishment. Extractivism propagated by global capitalism and state-sanctioned interventions perpetuates geopolitical climate necropolitics within and beyond borders. So our very own nation states in the global South are quite complicit in some of the destruction. Yet after decades of evidence on escalating climate impacts, there has been very little mitigation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the global North and increasingly among the elite in the global south. Climate apartheid is how many scholars have called this socio-spatial differentiation in who pays the disproportionate price of climate breakdown and are made expendable as a result, and who are spared for now. There are complex forms of abjection, precarity, uncertainty, exhaustion, and trauma amongst those deemed disposable. At the same time, it becomes imperative to recognize the differential intersectionalities within communities and how harms can be reproduced at various scales. Co-production of racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and imperialism continue in different ways, often supported by the local elites and community members who can be complicit. The confluence of local power imbalances, uneven creation of vulnerabilities, and production of risks end up merging global climate breakdown with scalar intersectional factors from the planetary to the body, thereby creating more complex tapestries of outcomes in different contexts. Ultimately, coloniality discursively limits the terms of global debate, hegemonizes knowledge of and about climate change and what actions are possible, therefore destroying other epistemologies. Hierarchical power relations and knowledge production are maintained in the enduring colonial matrix of power. Cognitive coloniality is maintained in a colonization of the mind in terms of what is knowable and what has valence. This coexists with epistemic violence and knowledge production and valuation of expertise. Since Eurocentrism, internalized racism, and colonialism, this system of power is hegemonic globally in how climate is talked about, the planning that is pursued, the dominant education around it. A lack of cognitive justice and epistemic decolonization is perpetuated in the reinforcement of climate coloniality, along with hegemonization of narratives, epistemologies, and climate solutions. Therefore, I argue that there is a very urgent need to decolonize climate in our efforts towards climate justice and to reframe narratives around climate change. Epistemology and materiality simultaneously are central in decolonization. What this means is both knowledge production and epistemological framings, but also engaging with praxis of material outcomes and lived experiences. So for instance, fossil fuel capitalism, neoliberal development paradigms, endless growth ideologies, maldistribution of material well-being, and so on. All of these have both discursive and material outcomes. To decolonize climate at a basic level is to therefore integrate more decolonial, anti-colonial, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist critiques and struggles into mainstream climate discourses and practices to redress ongoing oppressions and marginalizations. Fundamentally, though, decolonization necessitates the critical interrogations of complexities of empire, imperialism, capitalism, and then how to decenter them and dismantle them. It also confronts and addresses material outcomes of framings and reframings, internalizing a material praxis that takes co-production seriously. It is not just about recognizing the problems, but working towards distributive justice, reparations, and restitution. However, unreflexive celebration of transformative potentials does no one any favors. It would be impossible to deny the conformity and uniformity that development and capitalism try to systematically and rapaciously instill everywhere, or how capitalism reinvents itself through the very crisis it produces, both materially and discursively. The shrinking spaces of being otherwise and doing differently need to be acknowledged. Still, it is increasingly evident that maintaining racial and class privileges at a global scale are impossible in decolonizing climate justice. That is one of the tasks at hand. Liberation comes from destroying colonialism's impacts on lands, bodies, and psyches to overcome the apocalypse that continues to be coloniality. Or borrowing again from Frantz Fanon, moving away from alienation and dehumanization to self-realization in order to decolonize colonial traumas, healing the colonial wounds through transformative care, empathy, mutuality, and love hold possibilities. We desperately need to heal the colonial wounds everywhere. To achieve this, concerted work is needed on both the material and the political, and the discursive and epistemological, while recognizing that these are but analytical categories for discussion and are intricately intertwined in everyday life in spatioscalar ways. So what I'm going to do now is very briefly parse these out, but then bring them together again. So first, the material and the political. I want to return to the global scale for a moment to consider why there are persistent challenges to achieving decolonized climate governance ideologies and practices. Structural changes are necessary in international governance for equitable recognition and distributive justice to occur across and between countries, while desires for transforming equitable and exploitative systems are reiterated by different constituents and countries, as seen at the COPs and elsewhere. This tends to remain elusive. This is because contemporary governance systems are undergirded by centuries of colonial and imperial power structures and ideologies, whereby now a global network of nation states, corporations, and elite dominate discursive framings around climate and the material outcomes therein. Thus, challenges to and changes in the system are resisted. Opposition to empire dying is manifested in the resistance to shared governance, accountability, and giving up control, as these result in loss of existing and future power and material wealth. Nonetheless, different material solutions and outcomes have been imagined and insisted upon thus far. So we've seen demands being made of debt cancellation as part of climate reparations for countries of the global South, who have historically been impoverished and indentured through colonial and imperial finance mechanisms and capitalist extractivisms fueled by neoliberal global trade. So trade therefore becomes important. The debates around climate reparations obviously remain contentious, as loss and damage acknowledgement, or even a fund being created just a few days ago, has really not been followed through with sufficient financial support being released to various communities and countries. But reparations are more than that. It's about supporting world-making and material changes that account for histories of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In addition, decolonizing climate would also have to rethink and address various institutions and processes at multiple scales. One would be, for instance, the role of the nation state, where it sits vis-a-vis rise of mutual aid, calls for agroecological sovereignty, energy self-sufficiency, anti-capitalist and anti-neoliberal development, and degrowth. Decolonizing climate is largely meaningless if it doesn't come with measurable shifts in laws, policies, institutional frameworks, or material redistribution. So what we're seeing is that material outcomes are increasingly adjudicated, governed, and filtered through co-constitutive processes that need collaborative work and sharing of power. And that becomes a sticky point. But publicly accountable funding, technologies, and policies with requisite transformation of public institutions and capacities become central to this across the post-colonial and occupied worlds. Furthermore, there's another level of institutions that we need to consider. For instance, the role of international development institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and other donor funding, such as USAID and so on, come under critical consideration, because international development can and has perpetuated forms of neocolonial control over the post-colonial and occupied worlds through the operations of both state and non-state organizations, such as NGOs. And finally, through the cognitive conditions of citizens and the institutions on the ground. Development has material and ideological components through which coloniality is enacted and reproduced in capitalist colonial renditions across the global South. This occurs through the creation and promotion of desires of Western-style consumption in development models. It repeats colonialities of imperial violence through development logics, financing, geopolitics of debt, and Western educational hegemonization. Education that continues Eurocentric models of knowledge and production, circulation, and pedagogy also reify coloniality and colonization of the mind as development subjects and citizens are created every day, everywhere. In confronting climate coloniality, the need therefore arises of being mindful of the goal of not just undoing centuries of harm and ongoing devastations through policies, finance, interventions, and the media that are insidious in our everyday life, but also rebuilding and reconstituting in different ways, in more capacious and equitable ways. Scalar geographical analyses and critique are essential, both in confronting crises and in imagining co-constitutive solutions. A reworking of relationships becomes necessary across, across geopolitical scales, but also in human and non-human relationships. Valuing indigenous and traditional knowledge and sciences worldwide is essential to this. Indigenous work in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Palestine point to the ways that internal colonization has been resisted in settler colonial contexts. These offer insights into border crossings for abolition justice, but these are by no means the only examples. As anti-colonial movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are replete with examples of struggles and reconstitutions. These are linked to ongoing global indigenous and peasant-led resistances against extractive exploitative practices. What is evident is the urgent for solidarities across front lines for decolonization, reformulation of institutions and power matrices across scales, alongside geopolitical shifts in advancing the valuation of a livable planet for all. This, therefore, has to also include epistemic decolonization and a recommitment to collective action that crosses borders and boundaries. So this then brings me to the second part that I called the discursive and the epistemological. So in conjunction with the material injustices, securitization of profit, and geopolitical planetary control, addressing discursive and epistemological climate coloniality becomes important. Imperialism is underpinned by colonial forms of racialization and race science, devaluing other knowledges and expert voices from marginalized populations, often undergirded by Orientalism, as theorized by Edward Said. This raises the urgency of decolonizing knowledge production on climate change. The same talking heads, often from the global north, white and male experts, tend to dominate climate conversations globally, rather than those experiencing long-standing climate devastation or producing place-based knowledge. While whitewashing of climate discourses and intellectual spaces is increasingly critiqued, it is still not enough. Thus, decolonizing climate is very much about knowledge production in terms of who is cited, which epistemologies, whose ontologies, and so on, but also who is invited to speak, who is heard, who helps set agendas. It is not just about having a seat at the table, for instance, participating at the COPs, but determining what the table is, which means the terms of the debate or framing of the conversations and having actual decision-making powers. Ultimately, it is a shifting of the critical geopolitics of knowledge production, as well as re-evaluating of expertise and experts. Climate coloniality is thereby perpetuated through mundane and institutionalized ways of subalternization of non-Eurocentric, non-masculinist, and non-capitalist understandings of climate, ecology, and nature-society relations. As a result, decolonizing educational systems are fundamental, as this is where systemic cognitive injustice often began through formalized, westernized Eurocentric education that has gone global. Epistemic violence and colonization of the mind need to be acknowledged and undone across universities, training centers, non-governmental organizations, and state institutions. At the same time, it is an understanding of each of our own complicities in perpetuating harms and actively working to redress it through everyday praxis and re-education. Similarly, concepts of ecocide and epistemicide help further clarify how knowledges were erased and devalued, but need recovering and reconstituting. The decolonization of the mind remains critical for epistemic justice and pluriverse, where recuperation of collective memory and cultural practices to foster conviviality are important in order to overcome the colonial matrix of power. Deconstructing climate coloniality allows for an understanding of how climate change continues to condition the material realities and discourses, not only around nature-society relationships, but also the epistemic violence that follows in its wake. It is the undoing of this that is at stake, than the remaking of futures not haunted by the past or nor present. Decolonizing knowledge systems to confront climate coloniality requires indigenization of knowledge and politics. Throughout history, this has not only been ignored, silenced, and resistant in dominant discussions on climate, but often violently oppressed or erased. Yet, power exists in the shadows, forging solidarity and cultural continuity against great odds. Therefore, climate coloniality temporally and spatially causes eroding and erasure. But there are also fissures that rupture through its weight, resist its imposition, and rework it. Multiple forms of knowledge may be excluded in hegemonic climate discourses and practices, but are valuable cosmologies of decolonial knowledge and resistance that center accountable, reciprocal, and ethical relations and processes across the globe. There are many different ways that decolonization is enacted, ranging from direct action, law, care networks, leapfrogging alliances, cultural resurgence, and more that center Black, Indigenous, and people of color futures or BIPOC futures. I'll give you some quick examples. For instance, blockades, resistance movements, and land back claims are community claims building for liberatory practice. Speaking in one's native tongue, collective memory and culture rebuilding, retelling of historiographies, and celebrating human and non-human kinship are some strategies. Native singing and dancing are resistance, and valuing storytelling is decolonial action. Reclaiming sacredness is anti-colonial, and counter stories and counter mapping are fecund strategies of opposition. Defending territorial ontologies is decolonial politics. Recognizing relational entanglements and healing foster well-being and convivialities. To celebrate resurgence in cultural practices of art, literature, oral traditions, poetry, and dance is to reclaim agency, desire, futurity, and spirit. These examples are all simultaneously coping mechanisms, refusals, and decolonial actions. However, it is also vital to not fetishize prehistories as frozen time or culture as some magical solution to systemic oppression, but recognize how they propel. This is the important part. They propel or they instigate or they sustain further decolonization and revolutionary resistance. These foster fleshing out theories and grounding concepts. It is an affirmation of the humanity of the oppressed and of fostering radical equality and mutuality. In other words, the agency and the corporeality of the colonized come to matter. The realities and concerns of those caught up in epistemic entanglements and frictions need to be worked through, where reconciliation may not be entirely possible, but differences can coexist. That is the point of pluriversality instead of universality, as argued by scholars such as Arturo Escobar and others. It is to make visible and draw attention to knowledge and lived experiences, to ground theory in places geographically and ontologically. This involves valuing transgressive oppositional grays from those within. It insists upon not just engaging with scholarship and bearing witness to harm and violence, but accepting on their own terms the lived experiences and testimonials of self and family members, of kin and ancestors, among those subjected to coloniality. This process validates and gives agency to the enunciating, embodied, and knowing subjects whose lived experiences, praxis, and cosmologies matter. It involves deep listening through the roars, the whispers, and the silences that exist. Through such processes, ethics of care, care networks, and prioritization of collective well-being instead of only individual well-being become more clarified. This accounts for embodied, ecological, economic, and political safety from harm and fosters flourishing. Healing the colonial wound through transgressive love and solidarity become possible. Alienation is fought against with reclaiming of sacredness and relationalities and moving towards liberation and self-determination without apolitically or ahistorically fetishizing or romanticizing the local, our communities, or cultures. There is increasing recognition that resurgence and renewal are possible, seeded through the fertile grounds of the colonial wound to move beyond its conscriptions towards strategies of revival. As again, Frantz Fanon reminded us, we need to dismantle colonial oppressive institutions and apparatuses for true liberation, collective liberation, mind you, not just emancipation, therefore becomes critically necessary. What is evident in all this is that political liberation from climate coloniality will rely on allyship and solidarities in intentional anti-colonial projects from peoples across occupied, post-colonial, and settler colonial contexts, particularly amongst BIPOC communities across continents. Political consciousness informed by an anti-colonial politics is necessary for decolonization and abolition. Kinship building can be fraught, I recognize. It needs humanity and humility, overcoming alienation, acknowledging differences and commonalities to build shared goals. Again, it's intentional and shared goals. Those are critical to remember. But we know that the worlds we inhabit are full of complicity, compromise, and contradictions, of maintaining white supremacy and racial capitalism, and of moves to innocence and guilt. Collective endeavors are arrived at through intentional, concerted, and reflexive work. It may be challenging, but it is critically necessary. Decolonization thus must build political community and practical solidarities that foster pluriversality and reparative relations across the globe and restore humanity and agency in the battle against climate change and climate coloniality. The ruthless extractions and dispossessions from across territories showcase the connections across place-based materialities to broader extractive ideologies and colonial capitalist greed. In other words, it is essential to pursue decolonization so that it is not some uncritical celebration of transnational solidarity devoid of material politics or intersectional analysis. Ultimately, there is no single blueprint for decolonizing climate, as decolonization is a process and not an event. It is in the many acts, small and large, acting in constellations and in collectivities over time and place that bear results. So now I want to just bring everything to a conclusion because I've talked about many complex, detailed things. So what I want to just wrap up with is by reminding us that colonialism haunts the past, present, and future through climate. Imperialism continues through neocolonialism, racial capitalism, development interventions, education, training, and the media. Climate coloniality is expressed in various forms, such as through fossil fuel capitalism, neoliberal growth models, and hyper-consumptive lifestyles, but also through structures and systems built and held in place by powerful alliances globally. Climate coloniality seeps through everyday life across space and time, weighing down and curtailing opportunities and possibilities through a toxic mix of global racism, rapacious extractivism, colonial dispossessions, climate debts, and patriarchy. Dominant discussions around climate tend to make climate change seem apolitical, as a physical phenomenon to be fixed only with technology and finance, instead of a restructuring of relationships to ecologies, waters, lands, and communities we are intimately, materially, and geopolitically connected to. I have demonstrated how lived experiences are emotionally embodied complex processes and fraught conditions, but are legitimate sites of geopolitical knowledge and counterbalances to hegemonic framings and structural forces. To decolonize is to reveal, reassess, and dismantle colonial structures and discourses, make them non-universal, demonstrate the hegemony deployed historically and through particular racialized colonial practices and everyday tactics of oppression and empire building. Decolonizing climate, therefore, needs to tackle with the complexities of colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, and development in the reproduction of ongoing colonialities through existing global governance structures and institutions, discursive framings, material outcomes, and imagined futures. In the end, the terrors of colonialism foreclosed various conditions of possibilities, of futurities and flourishings that we will never know. Working through this pain and unknowing allows for healing and can promote formulating liberatory praxis. Coloniality has remade and continues to remake the past, the present, and future of many peoples. We are altered, reconfigured, expendable, but we are not passive agents in this, despite our various constrained circumstances. We live, we resist, we rebelled, we rejoice, and we refuse. But we also feel sorrow for a past that never got to be, a present that is incomplete, unknowables that haunt and peak. These are the fertile grounds where the colonial and imperial wounds and resultant rage, grief, and fear are not minimized, but recognized as part of the driving forces of healing, of resurgence, and of liberation. One thing is very clear: feeling, embodying, and experiencing impacts of climate coloniality is a very steep price to pay for knowing it. However, speaking about it is an essential component to confronting it and pursuing decolonial futures of abundance and flourishing. Without pathologizing or objectifying those enduring climate coloniality, we need to be able to hear and heed their suffering, learn from the embodied emotional geographies of climate, while also registering and celebrating a multiplicity of local voices, stories, ideologies, and cosmologies, of strengths and convivialities. Politics of indifference, discounting, silencing, ignoring, co-optation, and theft can no longer continue. This is important in dismantling climate coloniality for emancipatory futures. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I just want to point out a couple of publications that inform this talk, which are accessible via my website, which is literally my name.com, farhanasultana.com. And I'll also put these particular publications in the chat box for those of us who are going to remain in Zoom. And I believe we're going to be opening up for Q&A, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you so much.